and welcome to Our Homes. Katherine Einstein is our guest today. She is an associate professor of political science and director of undergraduate studies at Boston University. Her interests include local politics and policy, racial and ethnic politics, and American public policy. Her first book was titled Do Facts Matter? Information and Misinformation in Democratic Politics. And her most recent book, published this year, is Neighborhood Defenders, Participatory Politics and America's Housing Crisis. Professor Einstein, welcome to Our Homes.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you all about these important issues and to learn from you sort of about how these housing challenges are manifesting in Hawaii. So I'm going to share my screen. Make sure I get the right one here. All right. So can everyone see these slides okay? Thumbs up. I've got slides showing. Good. Awesome. All right. So the work I'm going to present to you guys today and talk about comes from a book that I wrote with my Boston University colleagues, David Glick and Max Palmer, called Neighborhood Defenders. And we're really interested in understanding the politics of housing and how people and neighbors are able to shape what gets built where. And the place that I want to start is this lovely abandoned warehouse in Porter Square, Cambridge, which is a very dense part of the city of Cambridge, next to Somerville, next to the city of Boston. It has a mass transit link right there, the subway stop. So this was really a great opportunity to get housing that was really transit accessible. And so a developer in 2015, he purchases this abandoned warehouse and he proposes replacing it with 4 condominium units, each with 1 parking space. And because he was converting a commercial use to a residential one, he had to go before the Cambridge Planning Board in order to get a special permit. And so those proceedings, they start pretty reasonably enough. The developer presents his plans, and then the Cambridge Planning Board, they ask a real series of technocratic questions and largely seem to be approving of the project. But then neighbors have an opportunity to speak, and their input is very much solicited as part of the process. And the neighbors uniformly showed up in opposition to this project. And here's just a sampling of some of the concerns that they raised. Some were worried about insufficient parking at this condominium development. Others, actually, who were lawyers, showed up with documentation that supposedly showed that this was a development that didn't comply with local zoning. And the planning board took these concerns seriously. After hearing from neighbors, they said, okay, we're going to ask for an additional parking study, and we're going to ask for an additional structural engineering study, each of which can cost $10,000+ plus. And so the developer goes off and does those things and comes back in a few months, having spoken to the neighbors and saying, okay, after doing these studies and talking to the neighbors, now we're going to propose a development with 3 condominium units, each with 2 parking spaces. And after this whole neighborhood conversation, the development is built. It's approved that way. And now there are actually 3 condominium units there, each with 2 parking spaces. And so what we were really interested in understanding in this book was really unpacking this process, because one interpretation is this is how local democracy should work. These were neighbors sort of valiantly checking developer access. But another version of what happened is that this was actually an example of an empowered, privileged group of neighbors using land use regulations as a way of controlling what happened in their communities and blocking newcomers. And this may seem like really, who really cares if you go from 4 condominium units to 3? That's not exactly going to solve a housing crisis. But when this process repeats itself hundreds and thousands of times over, it starts to have a really marked impact on the housing supply. So understanding the dynamics of these community meetings, we thought is really critical to understanding why it is that some places aren't building enough housing to meet demand and what we can do about it. So thinking about this more generally in the broader American context, we know that land use regulations across a wide variety of places create opportunities for neighborhood defenders, a group that we call neighborhood defenders, to stop or delay developments, both big and small. And this has a lot of different consequences. So first, when you make it harder to build, and this one has been really well documented by economists and by other researchers, we contribute to exploding housing costs and create obstacles to constructing dense multifamily developments. But what is perhaps a little bit less well understood is that these land use regulations have real political consequences too. They empower an unrepresentative group of older white homeowners to control what happens in their communities. And they also fragment housing reform coalitions and make it harder to assemble different groups of folks together to come up with sort of really progressive housing legislation. So for folks who are maybe less familiar with the nitty gritty of how these kinds of land use regulations work, typically the way it works in most of the United States, because of the way that land use is regulated, is basically anytime a developer wants to build roughly more than one unit of housing, they usually have to get some kind of approval from a planning or a zoning board or an equivalent kind of agency. And so what that means is that they have to go in front of the public, and the public has an opportunity to comment on these developments. And so in many places, neighbors and abutters are officially invited to participate in the housing development process. They get notifications required by law about a proposed development in their communities. Many of these laws actually explicitly empower neighborhood associations and neighborhood councils, and others actually explicitly empower property owners. So there's statutes in California and Massachusetts and many other places that actually explicitly say that these notifications have to go to adjacent landowners or property owners. So they don't always go to renters in these communities. And while this is obviously a webinar about housing, our book was about housing, I want to flag that this power of the neighborhood, and especially neighborhood associations and councils, this is not just limited to housing. This is actually an issue that has a big impact on really important transportation policy issues, or even things like whether restaurants get permits or not. So to really understand what happens in these community proceedings, my co-authors and I dug deep into meeting minutes of planning and zoning boards. And so we downloaded all planning board and zoning board meeting minutes for a 3-year period for 97 cities and towns in Massachusetts. And so we went through thousands of pages of meeting minutes to learn about the politics around the construction of more than one housing unit. So we looked at every single meeting that involved more than one housing unit. And so that's everything from accessory apartments and other forms of infill development to large apartment complexes. And the reason we focus on Massachusetts is not actually because we live here and that we're Boston University professors. It's that Massachusetts meeting minutes provide an unusual level of detail about the folks who participate in these meetings. So they tell us the names, addresses, and positions taken on proposed housing developments. In about 50% of cases, we were also able to learn the reasons that individuals gave for either supporting or opposing a proposed housing development. So we were able to learn a lot of detail about 3,300 commenters and who made 4,200 comments over this 3-year period. So just from reading these meeting minutes and going through all of them, we can learn whether someone supported or opposed a proposed housing development and why they supported it, which is in and of itself really valuable information that no one has actually gone out and documented at these meetings, the extent to which people are supportive or opposed to housing development. But the really amazing thing, and again, the reason that we focused on Massachusetts was because they provided the addresses of the people who participated at these meetings. We could learn really interesting demographic information about them by merging them with the voter file and CoreLogic property records. And so from those administrative data sets, we were able to learn whether or not someone was a homeowner, how old they were, their partisan identification, their length of registration at an address, their vote history, and using a name matching algorithm, we were able to estimate the probability that they belonged to a particular racial or ethnic background. And so what we did is we compared the demographics of the people who participated in these public forums to voters. And I want to stress here that our reference category here, it wasn't the general public, it was voters, which is in and of itself a more privileged subset of the population. So compared to voters, we found that commenters were significantly more likely to be men and white, and they were dramatically more likely to be over the age of 50 and homeowners. So these are really sizable disparities. Like when you see a participatory disparity of 27 percentage points, that is a huge deal in political science or really any research. Like these are big disparities, and they're bigger than a lot of other kinds of political inequalities and disparities that people are rightfully really concerned about. So this is a really important problem with the way that these public hearings are working. And I want to stress this isn't just a story about a bunch of rich white suburbs outside of Boston having really unrepresentative demographics. A lot of the cities in our sample were actually sort of down and out places, old mill towns, and very, very racially and ethnically and socioeconomically diverse places. And across the board in every single city and town that we studied, these patterns persisted, that the people who are most likely to show up to these public hearings were the most privileged subsets of their communities. Perhaps surprising no one who has ever been to one of these hearings, the people who show up are also overwhelmingly opposed to the construction of new housing. So only 14% of people who show up to these public hearings show up in support of the construction of new housing. And so we look at this and say, like, clearly this public participation process is skewed really heavily towards the people who want to block housing development, that an overwhelming majority of people who are showing up to these public hearings are showing up to oppose the construction of new housing. And they're doing this to oppose affordable housing, and they're doing it to oppose market rate housing. They're doing it to oppose huge apartment complexes, and they're doing it to oppose a townhouse going in. So this isn't sort of related to the types of projects, and it's not related to whether it's affordable or market rate. And so the people who show up to these hearings have a lot of different strategies to sort of get their way. The first is that many of them are real experts. They're lawyers, they're architects, they're in construction in some way. They will use their professional expertise in some capacity to try to block the construction of new housing. One of my favorite ones involved a doctor who showed up to a public hearing and used his sort of medical expertise to talk about ambulance speeds and arrival times, and how the traffic created by this new proposed housing development would make it so that ambulances would take longer, and that would be sort of a critical problem, right? And so that's the kind of expertise that can be really convincing to board officials, many of whom don't have that kind of expertise or don't want to really challenge it in these kinds of public settings. Another way that these folks are really effective is because they're often politically organized through things like neighborhood associations or neighborhood councils that are incredibly politically powerful. And they can sometimes bring along public officials like city council members to these meetings. Finally, and when we interviewed affordable housing and market rate developers, they felt this was the most important thing. There are lawsuits and the threat of lawsuits, which can make development stretch on for years and make it incredibly expensive. So as we studied these meeting minutes, we saw a lot of people either who themselves were lawyers or who showed up with lawyers, clearly in sort of to signal their litigious intent. We also found many cases, we actually linked the people who participated in these public hearings with lawsuits that were later filed in land court about the development in question. So taking sort of a bigger picture lens at these findings, what we found is that advantaged people and advantaged communities are more likely to show up in opposition to the construction of all types of new housing. So this is true for large projects and small projects, affordable and market rate. And what this means as we think about sort of the bigger political picture and where housing is distributed, it means that advantaged places are disproportionately protected from development, and it leaves less advantaged places that can't mobilize all of those resources more vulnerable to development. And this reality, this sort of inequality in who is affected by new development, makes for really challenging coalition politics when we're trying to build statewide movements in places like California and Massachusetts to reform local land use and to sort of change the way that we do housing. So we know that these wealthy areas are better able to organize to oppose housing. Developers are also aware of this. When we did interviews with developers, a lot of them would rattle off a list of communities in their local area that they would never ever try to propose a development to because they know the opposition will be so fierce. And so instead, they go to these communities where they expect less opposition. And so this means that gentrifying areas bear the brunt of development pressures. And understandably, because they are forced to deal with all of this development, they're really reluctant to endorse solutions that are oriented towards market rate housing. I think the most highly publicized manifestation of this has been in California, where the battles over SB 827 and now more currently SB 50 have really shown this cleavage between tenants' rights organizations and people who sort of support more market rate and market oriented solutions. So, thinking more generally about what kinds of policy reforms might help to address some of these issues, I want to stress, because I think sometimes this can get people sort of get lost in the weeds a little bit when you talk about something like land use regulations, is that land use reform is super important. I think this is like a very important, it may be the most important thing that local governments do, but it's a critical part, right? I put that in red for a reason. It's a part of addressing the housing crisis. It cannot be the only solution in isolation. And so I think that it would be enormously helpful for us to sort of to accomplish our housing goals, to make it easier for cities and towns to upzone. We should have regulatory frameworks that make that as easy as possible, and we should allow for more high density housing in communities with good transit access, with high opportunity schools, things like that. We should be allowing more high density housing there by right, and that would go a long way towards helping to address our critical housing shortage. There are also at the margins things I think we could do to make our meetings run much better. We could change the way that we notify people about meetings to make sure that renters know what's going on. We could institute, and this is actually something that judicial systems have used, we could institute a kind of waiting period where sort of planning and zoning boards maybe wait a day or two before issuing a decision. All too often, as we read the meeting minutes, we would encounter situations where planning board officials would basically get yelled at for 3 hours and then have to immediately make a decision. And I think it can be really tempting, if you've spent 3 hours getting yelled at by your neighbors, to at least try to come up with some kind of compromise when a compromise may not actually be appropriate. Finally, we also think that there needs to be sort of stricter guidance, and we use the language of pre-registration, which is something that has come in vogue in academia, but there needs to be much stricter guidance and requirements for when local governments make developers provide studies, like traffic studies or parking studies. All too often, we would find that a developer would produce something like a traffic study that the planning board, or rather planning officials in the city would accept. And then when they presented the traffic study to the community, a whole bunch of people would challenge the traffic study. And so the developer would end up having to provide 4 different traffic studies because of objections raised by members of the community. And that makes development tens of thousands of dollars more expensive. So cities and towns need to be a lot clearer about what the requirements are for building in a city, because the uncertainty is one of the sort of biggest problems for developers. But finally, and I think most importantly, we cannot just be looking to the local level to solve these critical issues. It's very hard to imagine this right now, given our federal government, but we really do need sort of a dramatic shift in how our federal government thinks about housing, and more state level resources in many places marshaled to improve affordability. That all of the things I've talked about are not going to produce subsidized affordable housing at the scale that we need, particularly in the context of a pandemic where many people are at risk of losing their safe and stable housing. So thank you so much. For more information about our research or these data or the book, you can visit our website, and I really look forward to talking about this further.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. That was a really a lot of content packed into a short amount of time. And to our audience, we do have time for questions, so feel free to enter any questions into the chat box. To get things started, Professor, your title of the book is Neighborhood Defenders. So what are neighborhood defenders, and how do they differ from other terms that our audience might be more familiar with, like NIMBYs?
Yeah, so I think right, the term that most people use to describe this phenomenon is not in my backyard. People who show up and say, I like more housing, but not right here because it's going to affect my property values. And one of the things that we found problematic about the term NIMBY is basically nobody thinks of themselves as a NIMBY, even if they're showing up to oppose a housing development. When you talk to people who are showing up to these hearings, who are showing up to oppose housing, they're not doing it. They don't perceive themselves as doing it for selfish reasons. Very few of them will state, I'm worried about my own property values. They're much more likely, when you look at the language of these hearings, to talk about community level concerns. And so, one case that really stands out to me is a woman who showed up to a hearing because she was concerned about the welfare of neighborhood turtles and sort of how they would be affected by proposed housing development. And we did not think that those kinds of concerns were really captured by the term NIMBY. We also think that sort of talking about these folks more as community defenders or neighborhood defenders helps us understand why they are so impactful with public officials. These are individuals who hold a lot of sway. And I think if public officials sort of recognized it as sort of typical NIMBYism, they would be less persuaded by these folks. But if instead it's sort of like, oh, they're raising really valuable community concerns, that becomes a lot more potent.
So speaking of this instinct that seems to be arising from people in both wealthy and poor communities, in it, among the communities that you surveyed, I wanted to focus in on one quote from your book, which from a lawyer stating, human instinct is to be adverse to change and like things the way they are and see other people as intruding, making things more dense, more traffic, more problems. And I thought that was just a great crystallization of a psychological phenomenon known as place attachment, which is very powerful. And people do experience real emotional trauma when physical surroundings change. Why are you advocating that we ignore this fundamental psychological part of, the human brain, and instead, why is it more important to embrace change rather than shrink from it?
Yeah, so I think first, the concept that you're raising, I'm so sympathetic to this. I think it can be really hard if you have spent 20 years walking with your family on a street and enjoying a particular set of views. It can be really hard to see those change, particularly if the change is dramatic. And so I think it is important to sort of acknowledge that people love their communities, and that should be a view that local officials respect. Sort of all that said, I think we also, as community residents, need to acknowledge sort of the positive forces of change. So I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and my neighborhood hasn't changed at all since I lived there. And the reason it hasn't changed is because Milwaukee is in steep economic decline. There aren't a lot of job opportunities there. Most of the people who grow up in the community who get sort of higher level degrees end up leaving the community. And so when I look at sort of places that are frozen in time, it is all too often because there isn't economic growth. And when we have economic growth, we have the need, we have more jobs, and with more jobs come more people. And so I think when we're in that kind of situation, I view it as if my community is changing, that says something really good about what's happening to my local economy. What's bad, right? And I think what people rightfully sort of react to when they think about those changes is if you're somewhere like San Francisco or Boston, where you've seen massive job growth, but it's also leading to escalating housing prices because the construction of new housing hasn't met demand. And so I think the cost of not changing the physical spaces of our neighborhoods, it's that people don't have homes. And so I think that we have to accept some level of change as a good thing, as a sign of economic growth, and as a sign that we need to include more people in our communities.
In your book, you point out that there are a lot of communities like Massachusetts, like California, like Hawaii, that are highly regulated when it comes to land use, where neighborhood defenders do have many opportunities to delay the process and so on. But you also point out that there are communities that don't have those same problems, whether it's a famous one like Houston, Texas, perhaps Milwaukee might be another one of those. There already seems to be a natural movement of population outflow from these highly regulated land use environments into less regulated ones like Texas. Now, why shouldn't we just accept that as the market solution, so to speak, to this, fundamental tension?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, right, potential sort of solution to this problem is that you have San Francisco gets too expensive, so the jobs move to other places. But we know from economics that agglomeration economies are real. And so, yes, there are some companies that will leave the San Francisco, they'll leave Boston. But by and large, industries like to cluster together. And they do this because it helps them sort of run more efficiently. And so I don't think that those jobs are moving to other places at the rate that you might expect, given sort of what's going on in those housing markets. And so instead, you end up with a world where these incredibly high opportunity cities, the ones where they're the most high paying jobs, are completely inaccessible to newcomers because the housing prices are so high. So I don't think there's that level of self correction because these businesses like being near each other. And so you don't necessarily get that spillover the way that you'd hope.
All right, let's go to an audience question. You mentioned during your PowerPoint that compromise might not be appropriate in certain situations. Can you give any concrete examples of when compromise would not be appropriate?
Yeah, so I think the example that I started my presentation with about a condominium development in Porter Square, which was proposed with 4 condominium units, each with 1 parking space. There was, given sort of the parking needs in that community, which is right next to the subway, there was absolutely no need to increase the number of parking spaces in that development. That rather than creating homes for people right next to a mass transit stop, the developer instead had to create homes for cars because of neighborhood concerns. And so I think sometimes this desire to compromise, again, in what seems like a really minor way on a project by project basis, systemically, when we look at the city as a whole, leads us to undersupply housing and oversupply cars. And so I don't mean at all for my comments to be interpreted as that we should never compromise. I think, especially when it comes to like community benefits agreements, when we can get developers to provide funding for important community amenities like sidewalks, parking, sewers. I mean, we could think of all sorts of different ways that developers can contribute to the community. I think those are the kinds of compromises that we should really be pushing for. But I think compromises that consistently involve developers scaling back the amount of housing that they're providing has done real social harm to communities.
Let's talk about some of the solutions that you've proposed, such as the changes to meeting rules. Can you describe any cities or jurisdictions that have successfully implemented them? And can you talk about what those results look like?
So basically, right now, I don't know that there's been a lot of conversations yet about reforming those public hearings, in part because it requires sort of state level changes to the laws. So one really interesting thing that's actually happened during this pandemic is that local government proceedings have all moved online. And that turned out to actually require sort of state law or emergency orders, depending upon the place, that there are very specific requirements with places with open meeting laws about when the public has access to sort of comment on local government proceedings. So that's all to say that I don't think there has been a ton of experimentation on this, but that we are in a moment right now where local governments have been forced to completely change the way that they incorporate public input. And so one of the things that my co-authors and I are actually measuring right now is in those same communities we studied back 2015 through 2017, how has participation in those forums changed now that many of them are on Zoom or online? The other thing that we've been trying to document is that there's actually been huge variation between local governments and how they've chosen to go online. Like some of them are just really phoning it in and not doing much of anything. They're just sort of shutting down local government business, while others have come up with all sorts of innovative ways to try to reach out to populations who ordinarily wouldn't jump in. Some local governments have very well-run Zoom meetings, others less so. So I think there's been really interesting variation and something that we're going to try to continue to unpack. But I think that's sort of our best opportunity to understand how changes in the way that meetings are run may change the demographics of people who participate and also change what they say online. Are supporters more likely to show up? We'll find out.
On that point, in your book, you mentioned that actually some of the outreach reforms to broaden the outreach for projects like this actually have the unintended consequences of boosting opposition to projects. So Are there ways to, walk that balance?
Well, so the literature we talked about in the book, which is actually probably just more generally of interest to folks as they think about election reform in our current sort of national election system, is that there's been really great research that shows that when we try to do things like early voting, we're actually making it easier for more affluent people to politically participate. Then we look at some types of reforms, and early voting is one that really stands out. We actually exacerbate political sort of disparities in who participates. Interestingly, same-day registration actually boosts participation among low-income folks because it generates sort of huge amounts of excitement around politics while also making it easier to vote. And there's been recent evidence for people who are interested in this on mail-in voting, which shows that it also boosts political participation among low-income voters. So I take that broader research, and as I think about it in the context of participation around housing development, to say that efforts to boost participation don't always go the way we plan. Sometimes, yes, they boost participation, but they attract not necessarily the population that we were hoping to sort of help vote. And other times they work exactly as reformers intended and make it easier for folks to participate who otherwise wouldn't have. And so I think I take that research as I apply it here to just say that we should be really cautious about these kinds of reforms and also evaluate what we're doing. I think all too often in politics and policy, understandably, local and state governments don't necessarily have the resources to evaluate the kinds of reforms that they do. And I hope to encourage folks to partner with local academics, local think tanks, whoever it is, to try to evaluate whether the reforms that you've implemented have actually had their intended consequences.
So let's say we do implement a bunch of reforms, whether it's meetings, whether it's by right zoning, upzoning, and so on. And let's say that those reforms in a particular community do impact the makeup of the community. Maybe we have more non-white, or we have less affluent residents of the community now. In some ways, we saw this happen back during the 1950s and 60s when various discriminatory segregation provisions were being removed, and a phenomenon known as white flight happened. So when these communities did start to diversify, very quickly, the more affluent and disproportionately white members of the community simply sold their homes and departed for other communities that they could exclude more, and that just exacerbated the racial and other problems of the community. It seems that even if we succeed on one level, we could be winning the battle and losing the war, because there seems to be something very deep-seated about people not wanting to live around people who are not like them, who don't want their physical surroundings to change very much. Are we just shifting the goalposts, but not necessarily changing the ultimate outcome of the situation?
Yeah, so I guess I would say it is clearly the case that when we look at racial segregation in the United States, it's this really endemic and really hard problem to solve, and it has all sorts of negative consequences for everyone, right? Like, it's this racial segregation produces these incredibly negative economic, social, and political outcomes, and has proved, again, to be like really intractable. All that said, there is big variation across American cities in the extent to which they are racially segregated. And so I do think we can find neighborhoods and cities where people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds do share neighborhoods and do share them in sort of a stable and successful way. And I think diversity in the built environment is absolutely critical to that. We know if we have more different types of housing in communities, we get more different types of people. And I think I care most deeply about diversity along racial and ethnic lines because of our country's long and ugly history of using policy to deliberately segregate people by race. But I also care deeply about diversity by age, diversity by income. And when we have a lot of different types of housing in a place, I think there can be really positive outcomes. As just sort of one personal example, I live in a community that is a mix of single family and two family homes. And it allows for a lot of different kinds of folks to live here. The single family homes are occupied by a lot of parents with school age kids. And then the condominiums are actually often occupied by either younger couples who don't yet have kids, or sort of empty nesters. And because we had those condominiums, with the pandemic going on, my parents wanted to move closer to us. They were able to afford a condominium that was 2 blocks away from us. They never would have been able to afford a single family home in our neighborhood. So I do think that the diversity of housing stock allows for more people at different stages of life and from different walks of life potentially to move to a community.
All right, let's move to another topic that we have discussed on this webinar before, and which you treat in your book, which is the battle over California's Senate Bill 827, which would basically upzone and allow for greater density in areas near transit and near job centers. Now, this was a very high-profile national fight, and because it was so high-profile, there were a lot of divisions that were exposed in the community. And you talk about the divisions between two groups of housing activists. On the one hand, we have poor, often minority renters who tend to oppose new development that would be unaffordable to them. And on the other hand, we have wealthier, often white, often younger advocates who might call themselves NIMBYs, who advocate strongly for upzoning. Why do you think that these two groups are at odds? And do you think that there is any way to bridge the gap on, what might be a common goal or common ground for the two?
Yeah, so I think the YIMBYs in California had a reputation, and I'm sure if you've had folks on here from those groups, I'm sure they would contest this. But there was this reputation for them early on as being dominated by tech bros who just wanted to have more market rate, luxury kind of housing, and who weren't acknowledging sort of broader structural inequalities in San Francisco. And I think one of the challenges with something like SB 827 was that it didn't acknowledge the spatial inequality in who had been bearing the brunt of development. So SB 827 essentially would have allowed for more development. It would have upzoned all these areas around transit stops. And activists in Los Angeles in particular were deeply upset about this because it would have upzoned communities that were already facing really steep gentrification pressures, who had already borne the brunt of development. And there's actually really good research by urban planners in Los Angeles that communities that were low income and communities of color were much more likely to be upzoned than more affluent communities. And so this was one thing the state senator who proposed SB 827, Scott Wiener, really learned from that example of SB 827 and tried to address some of those concerns in SB 50. But I think there's still this real reluctance. And again, it's particularly situated in Los Angeles. I think that's an incredibly important seat of political power in California, and one that was really reluctant to go along with these proposals, again, because of these gentrification concerns. And so I think there's always going to be this tension that people who want more market rate housing, and they're right, we need more market rate housing, but we also need more subsidized affordable housing. And the policies that give us more market rate housing will never produce enough subsidized affordable housing to meet the needs of folks who are most desperate for it. And so I think that has been one sort of real challenge in assembling a housing coalition, is that it's really hard to accomplish those goals simultaneously. And the people who desperately want more subsidized housing feel rightfully really frustrated that their concerns are all too often ignored at the state level, and that it's proven really hard to sort of accomplish those goals.
Two jurisdictions, Oregon and Minneapolis, have actually moved forward with new multifamily housing bills that do allow greater density, like duplexes and triplexes and fourplexes on formerly single-family lots. Is it too early to assess empirically whether those have had the effects that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I think the problem is right now we really can't assess it because it was too recent, and now of course we have a global pandemic that's going to have incredibly sizable effects on our housing markets for years to come, given the sort of economic downturn. So I think it's going to be really hard to know for a while about how much of an effect sort of radical plans like Minneapolis's effort to end single-family zoning have on the overall supply of housing. My guess will be that these kinds of programs will have an important effect on the provision of market rate housing, but in and of themselves, they're not going to sort of solve the problem of insufficient subsidized housing in places that need it. Again, those it really has to be, it has to be accompanied by state and federal investments. And so I look at zoning reforms like what's happened in Oregon and Minneapolis as really exciting. They're critical, necessary first steps, because if we want to have massive federal investments in building, say, more public housing also goes through the zoning review process. And there are many examples of sort of the public review process in local areas making it harder to build fully subsidized housing. And so I think if we want to have those kinds of investments in affordable housing, we first need to get our zoning right, and make it as easy as possible to build affordable housing.
So on the topic of government provision of housing through public housing, subsidized housing, and so on, given the economic crunch that many jurisdictions are facing, I'm sure it's true in Massachusetts, it's certainly true in Hawaii. In the short term, it does not look particularly likely that states and localities will be able to make greater investments in housing. Republicans in Congress, as we speak, are negotiating relief packages, but housing doesn't seem to be one of the top priorities as we're coming out of this pandemic. How would we achieve greater amounts of subsidized housing for those who really need it?
I mean, this feels like a very partisan comment to say, but we needed a change in the federal administration. It is very hard for me to imagine a world where the powers that are currently in the Oval Office and in the Senate, if those officials stay in power, it's very hard to imagine a world where we get the kind of massive investment in housing that we really need. We really need sort of an investment on the order of what happened during the New Deal. I think we need to reshape housing policy sort of on that scale to really solve the problem facing many American cities, and sort of raising the specter of the New Deal. We need to have that level of involvement in housing markets, but we need to be a lot smarter than what we did during the New Deal. We need to not do redlining or subsidizing single family homes in sprawling suburbs. But I think an investment on that scale that's done with sustainability and inclusivity at its heart could have just an incredible effect on American cities, especially places that most need to build more housing.
Now, those eras of American history, whether the New Deal, the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, when there was very significant federal investment in public housing, produced their own after effects. And even to this day, Democrats supported the Faircloth Amendment that caps the net number of federal public housing units because, we're all familiar with the stereotypes of crime, cyclical poverty, drugs, gangs, that are associated with those federally subsidized public housing projects. Is there a modern version of public housing that would avoid many of those issues that came to the fore, especially in the 50s and 60s?
Yeah, so public housing is this really interesting area because it forces us to make incredibly hard trade-offs. So clearly the most effective way and cheapest way to build as many housing units for people who need it as possible is to build large towers of subsidized housing. But as you flagged correctly, right, those were associated with all sorts of problems, because it turns out when we have concentrated poverty, we end up with lower quality public services, higher crime, and sort of other challenges in those communities. And so we have widely viewed it as undesirable to concentrate poverty to that extent. So the way that public housing has evolved, there's essentially two strategies, or two main ones. There's obviously lots of other smaller ones that public housing authorities have done. They've done scattered site low-rise developments. So you have buildings that are actually owned by the government, but they're much smaller. It's like you build, a townhouse development or, a 6-unit housing project instead of a 100-unit development. And you're able to keep things much more socioeconomically integrated when you do that. The other strategy is to provide vouchers, right? And so this is commonly known as the Section 8 voucher program, or housing choice vouchers, that allow you to take a federally funded voucher and use it to get a market rate apartment. And so that your relationship then is with the landlord. And that has had sort of more mixed efficacy in getting people into higher opportunity neighborhoods. So I think those are both potentially really promising avenues to avoiding that problem of concentrating poverty in towers. I think the downside of those approaches is that they house fewer people. So when Cabrini Green and Robert Taylor homes in Chicago were demolished, you ended up with a lot of poor people who suddenly no longer had homes, and in many cases ended up in suburbs sort of to the south of the city of Chicago that didn't have the sort of public resources to really help these individuals. And so I do think there's this really horrible and hard trade-off that we have to make as a society, because we've so dramatically underfunded this, between getting housing for as many people as possible, but in suboptimal conditions, or building public housing that is more optimal but can house fewer people.
Let's get back to the COVID pandemic, which has affected not only our economy, but our housing stock as well. Well, do you think that the coronavirus pandemic has an impact on the affordable housing situation other than the funding situation? And what do you think the housing picture will look like once the pandemic is over? What is our path forward from this pandemic?
Okay, it's terrible in so many different ways. So first, when we think, I think the most direct and clear way is when we think about the economic fallout from the pandemic and people losing their jobs. That's going to put them at such vulnerability to losing their homes. Right now, many communities still have eviction moratoriums in place, though those are starting to get lifted. And so those protections are gone in a lot of places, and the very limited federal protections for eviction may also be gone soon, right? So I think that's one problem. The second one, which you mentioned, and I just really want to underscore, is a lack of funds to provide rent relief or mortgage relief. That's huge. That's going to impact so many people. We're just not going to have the local government resources to deal with the crushing economic fallout from the pandemic. It's also, though, affecting the overall housing supply. So right now, in a lot of these high-cost metropolitan areas, there are way fewer houses on the market than there have been in previous years. And this intuitively makes sense. Most people aren't like eager to move in the middle of a pandemic. But when you have a lower housing supply, that is increasing the cost. And so one of the crazy things when I was looking at the Boston housing market, and I was so sure when the pandemic started that prices would start going down as people faced more anxiety about their jobs and just the general situation. And prices are going up because there's less overall supply. So that's obviously a concern. When we have less mobility, we're going to raise the price of the houses that are in the market. And finally, there's the effect on housing construction. So when places did shutdowns, there were construction moratoriums in many locations. The financing for developers has probably become a lot more challenging and will continue to do so as there's more cutbacks from different government agencies, and as banks may apply different